Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Lunch with Books live stream. We'll introduce our guest in just a moment. I have a couple of announcements first. Next week at this place, this channel and time, June 22nd, Robin Yoakum, who's a local man who's now a novelist, his new book is called The Sacrifice of Lester Yates. It's a sort of murder mystery, true crime book. He's been to Lunch with Books a few times, and I think he's really established himself now as a novelist. So we look forward to that. This Thursday at 6:30 p.m., Dr. Arthur Evans, who is arguably the preeminent expert on North American beetles, will be here in our entomology series to discuss that 250,000 species of beetles, which is the largest order of insects on the planet. Today, we are honored to have with us Professor A.C. Grayling. He is the founder and principal of New College of the Humanities at Northeastern University and its professor of philosophy. He is also a supernumerary fellow at St. Anne's College, Oxford. He is the author of over 30 books of philosophy, biography, history of ideas, and essays. He is a fellow with the Royal Society of Arts, a fellow with the Royal Society of Literature, vice presidents of Humanists UK, patron of the Defense Humanists, honorary associate of Secular Society, and a patron of Dignity in Dying. Today, he is here to tell us about his newest work, The Frontiers of Knowledge, What We Now Know About Science History and the Mind. Here's Professor A.C. Grayling.
Hello there, Sean. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm very, very well, thanks. It's a great delight to be with you.
Well, we are honored to have you here, and I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Well, this is a book which is about a paradox which has taught us a very great deal about our ignorance. Now, to explain that, it used to be thought by most reflective people in humanity that we knew it all because it's there in the holy books. So where the universe comes from, what it is, what its destiny is, why it exists, all these were questions that had answers there. But at the beginning of the modern period, so around about the 16th, 17th century, with the great revolution in philosophy and in the origins of science, of the natural sciences in that period, enquiry was regarded as something that would chip away at our ignorance, that the more we learned, the less the domain of our ignorance would be. But just in the very, very recent past, really just in the last few decades, when it comes to understanding of the brain and the mind, just in the course of the last century or so, in the case of fundamental physics and cosmology, and just in the last perhaps 150 years, really since the middle of the 19th century, our knowledge of the past, all these three domains, we've had a huge expansion of knowledge. Absolutely amazing expansion of knowledge in comparison to what was known and understood before. And the paradoxical result of that great expansion of knowledge is that we now know how very little we know. And this sounds a bit like Donald Rumsfeld here, but it's true that our understanding of the extent of our ignorance of things has really been taught us by this great expansion of knowledge. Give you an example. In the case of physics and cosmology, with the discoveries about the structure of the atom, about the size and age of the universe, about quantum theory, we've discovered that 95% of what constitutes the mass density of the universe is inaccessible to us in the form of dark matter and dark energy. So everything that we've learned, and on the basis of which we've been able to apply through technology, marvelous technologies of communications, computing, the devices that we use, our smartphones and our televisions and our emails, the whole internet phenomenon of social media and the like, is all predicated on a knowledge of just 5% of what constitutes the universe. Until about the second half of the 19th century, our understanding of history went back to more or less the sort of archaic period of ancient Greece, the period covered also in the books of the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament of the Bible. So the period really up to about 1000 BCE. And until the 19th century, the existence of the great civilizations of Mesopotamia, 4,000 years earlier than that in their origins, and the history of the Neolithic period of human development, and indeed the history of human evolution for hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of years before that, were completely unknown. And all this is the discovery of just this last century, a century and a half. So our examination of the nature of the universe and our examination of the past have revealed to us so much, and yet in doing so have taught us how little we really know about the universe and about the past. Similarly, with our understanding of brain and mind. Well, of course, we've been thinking about the mind and mental phenomena, and the phenomena of intention, desire, hope, memory, how we learn, the psychological characteristics of human beings through literature and through philosophy and so on for a very long time. But it's only in the last few decades, with the technology of magnetic resonance imaging of the brain actually in action, that we've really begun to start understanding the structure and functions of the brain and the central nervous system generally in much, much more detail. And here too, we realize the incredible complexity of the brain, something like 86 or more billion neurons and as many trillion connections between them, constituting what's now called the connectome of the brain, in which the immensely complex activity of mental life is generated. And so we're at the very beginning of something, but this is all terribly recent because of the recent nature of the technologies that have enabled this. Now, I'm not suggesting that this great expansion of knowledge has made us more stupid. It hasn't, of course not. It's given us a great access of power through the technologies that we now have to control aspects of the universe that we weren't able to control before. And it's given us a greater reach of understanding into all these things, both into the natural world, into the mind, and into the past. But one thing that it has done, which is really interesting, is that it has utterly changed the nature of inquiry. I said earlier that it used to be thought that the more we inquired, the more we found out, the less ignorant we were. That the increase of knowledge was the diminution of ignorance. And as we see, that isn't the case. So it used to be thought, that those of you who have read some philosophy will remember that in the theory of knowledge, it was thought that the challenges to knowledge are skeptical arguments which suggest to us that we have a hard time in finding the truth. So the skeptic says, well, you claim to know something, like, for example, the fact that you're looking at a screen now, or hearing somebody speaking, but how do you know that you're not deluded or dreaming, asleep and just thinking that you're doing these things? How can you be sure that the evidence that you have, even in a straightforward, optimal condition such as you're in at the moment, is really a good conduit of knowledge? Now, that kind of skeptical challenge was much debated. It's debated in Descartes, in the Meditations. He begins by saying, what can I know with certainty? Can I answer the skeptical challenges? And all the way through the philosophical tradition from Descartes until very recently in the 20th century, this was the chief topic of conversation. How do you defeat the skeptic? How do you show that you can justify your claims to know things? Well, now we find that the extension of knowledge reveals to us, as if we were climbing a mountain, and the higher we got, the further we could see, and the further we can see, the further we see the extent of our ignorance stretching away into the distance. So instead of being an attempt now to answer the skeptical challenges, it is an attempt instead to think about the kinds of barriers that we have to overcome in the course of our inquiries. Let me explain. One thing that we've learned is that we human beings, occupy a position in the scale of things in the universe, which is very, very particular, very, very narrow. If you go from the sort of Planck dimensions, like the Planck length, the very smallest unit of length we can think of, the smallest unit of time, the Planck time, all the way up to the size of the universe, which is 13.72 billion years old. If you think about that scale, we humans occupy a point just a bit above halfway in that scale of things. Now, do we really occupy a point just above halfway? Or is the fact that we can only see, so to speak, figuratively, down to the Planck dimensions or up to the limits of the visible universe, just an artifact of our limitations? Is that as far as we can reach? Is the universe much, much greater in range, much bigger in one direction, much smaller in the other direction? This point that we sit at a certain level in the scale of things means that we're looking at the universe through a pinhole. I call this the pinhole problem because we have a very, very partial and very limited view of the nature of physical reality. And we have to try to peer through that pinhole or push through it our probes, our microscopes and oscilloscopes and our other means of trying to get down to the smallest and up to the largest levels of things in order to try to understand their nature and their structure. So we have these limitations. And when we reflect on our position in the scale of things, we see something rather surprising, which is that the world around us, the world of automobiles and buildings and trees and people, is a kind of virtual reality. After all, your visual experience at this moment is actually a set of electrochemical processes in the occipital region at the back of your brain and in your temporal lobes. And out of these electrochemical activities, you are constructing a picture that seems to be representative of something outside your head, whereas in fact what's happening is inside your head. In just the same way as the icons, the symbols on the screen of your laptop computer are icons that represent rather complex goings on in the microprocessors inside your computer, so the pictures inside your conscious experience are icons which are really about very, very complex electrochemical activities and interactions with the atoms that constitute things outside you. So it's a virtual reality, it's a construct. And from this virtual reality, we are trying to infer something about the actual structure of physical reality. It's therefore no surprise that when you get down to the quantum theoretical level of description, that we find that it's very, very hard to interpret what's happening in the reality that quantum theory describes in terms that we can make sense of in our ordinary pinhole level, classical level of understanding. Causality doesn't work in the way that it does for our classical interpretations. The nature of quantum effects at that level are very difficult to make sense of. You know, the idea of the superposition of states, that cat is either or both dead and alive or neither dead or alive until the wave function is collapsed in some views, until an observation of it is made. That seems to make no sense from the point of view of how things are with us in our ordinary experience. And so we infer from this virtual reality a more fundamental reality, and then we find that we can't retranslate what we understand at that more fundamental reality back into our classical reality. And this is, therefore, a very intriguing and interesting challenge that we face in our attempt to make sense of the nature of reality in itself. And that's a function of what I call the pinhole problem, a challenge to the nature of inquiry. And there are a number of other such challenges as well. So, for example, you've all heard of the hammer problem. You know, if your instrument is a hammer, then everything is going to look like a nail. So if you have a particular way of inquiring, perhaps using mathematics to quantify phenomena, or using instruments to measure and detect the presence of things, maybe the instrument in question, the hammer that you're using, only finds nails out there and misses out other things that the instrument is not apt to recognize or measure or capture. There's also an allied problem, the so-called lamplight problem, which is that if you lose your keys in the dark, the only place you have a chance of finding them is under the lamplight, because that's the only place that you can see. So there's no point in looking in the dark parts outside the range of the lamplight. Then there's the problem of reading in. So when you meet with a phenomenon, not just in the natural sciences, but in history, for example, if you're doing archaeology and you dig up some remains, and in amongst these remains, one building is bigger than the others, how are you going to interpret that other than by using what you're used to, the concepts, the ideas that make sense of the world for you? In archaeology, it's very, very typical for people to interpret a large building, the remains of which they've discovered, as a temple or a palace. Well, that's a function of making use of what we're kind of used to in the way of big buildings in the past. Oddly enough, the big buildings that we have today tend not to be temples and palaces. They tend to be high-rise office blocks in downtowns, or stadiums, or football stadiums, or baseball stadiums. So future archaeologists, if something terrible happens to our world and it all gets buried, and hundreds of years from now, archaeologists dig up, Philly or Washington or New York, what are they going to make of the big football stadiums, or going to make of the footings of the high-rise buildings? What will they use to interpret what these things are? This is the so-called reading in problem, how we use what we're used to make sense of things that we encounter in our inquiries. Then there is what I call the Ptolemy problem. Ptolemy was famously a geographer and an astronomer in the early part of the first millennium, whose picture of the universe had the Earth at the center. And he had to organize the apparent anomaly of the way the planets moved against the background of the fixed stars by coming up with ideas about cycles and epicycles and the like. But his picture of the universe, even though it put the Earth at the center, was still useful for a certain range of purposes. So you could use Ptolemaic astronomy to navigate by when you were sailing on the seas. You could predict eclipses by using Ptolemaic astronomy. So even though it was wrong, it worked for certain purposes. So here's a problem. If you have a scientific theory and you can apply it and it works, does it follow that the scientific theory in question is true? Well, the Ptolemy problem shows that it may not be, and that other things need to be looked at. Other considerations have to be brought into play to check whether our knowledge is secure. And then there is what I call the Parmenides problem. Again, those of you who have studied some philosophy will remember that Parmenides was a very, very great philosopher before the time of Plato. In fact, he was an important influence on Plato. And he and Heraclitus were the two really great pre-Socratic philosophers. And Parmenides said, the universe has to be a single, perfect, unchanging thing. Because if it was more than one thing, and if it contained in it a lot of change, movement, decay, coming into being, going out of being, it would be unstable, and ultimately it would cease to exist. So because it does exist, and hasn't ceased to exist before now, this is a reason for thinking that it has to be a single, perfect, unchanging thing. Now, of course, that was just a pre-Socratic speculation, and you might think, well, okay, he was a philosopher who lived, 600 years BCE, a little bit after that, in fact, in the 5th century BC, and he would be without the kind of conceptual and scientific tools to make better sense of the universe. And yet, that Parmenidean assumption that ultimately there should be one thing, and that there's one thing must not neither come into existence nor go out of existence, is a tacit assumption of contemporary science. But looking for a unified theory, looking for a theory of everything, trying to get down to one thing or one kind of thing that exists, as it might be strings or superstrings, let us say, which are conserved so they don't come into or go out of existence. If they do come into existence as a result of, I don't know, fluctuations in the quantum vacuum or something, then in a sense, their existence is a permanent possibility. So the idea that ultimately reality is something which is a single thing or kind of thing, and that it is conserved in the sense that it doesn't cease to exist or come into existence, is an assumption which, in a very, very different disguise and a much, much more powerful apparatus behind it, still guides a great deal of thinking. The idea that the four forces of nature, gravity for large scale, and then the electromagnetic and the strong and weak nuclear forces, should all ultimately be unified into a single force. That ultimately all the quarks and leptons of the standard model of the atom should come down to one kind of entity at least, so strings, for example. This impetus to simplification, to unifying everything and to bringing everything down to an underlying basis is what, right from the time of Parmenides, and very probably before him, but at any rate has been a motivating and guiding principle in trying to make sense of things. It may be a very well-motivated intention. After all scientific discoveries have, of any great importance at any rate, have often proved themselves to have a lot of reach. So, for example, when Maxwell came up with the equations for electromagnetism, it turned out that this understanding of the relationship between magnetism and electricity also explained many other things too. For example, light. The theories of relativity, special and general theories of relativity, have also had much greater reach and included much greater range of phenomena than just the ones that they were initially addressed to. And so it looks as though the advance of knowledge ought to be, in being more inclusive, ought to bring things into more connection with one another. So there's no surprise that people should think, well, there are four forces in nature as we now understand it. Why can't there be three or two or ultimately one? And indeed, the sort of great holy grail of inquiry in physics is to try to unify general relativity and quantum theory, bringing together all the forces of nature together. But this is an application of what I call the Parmenides problem of reductionism, really, of trying to reduce things down to a single kind of explanatory level. It may be right. It is certainly the motivator or driver of a lot of inquiry, but we have to be aware of the fact that it is an assumption and a goal, and not something which is, as it were, by itself completely compelling, because it might turn out that there are not four forces, but 17, or some different picture might emerge as the limits of our knowledge grow, and as we find more interesting bits of things to be puzzled by in this growing domain of ignorance. So that's what this book is about. It's really an inquiry into firstly what people thought the frontiers of knowledge were, where those frontiers lie at the moment, what they've taught us about the nature of inquiry, and how much there is still to be done. It's a bit like this, as think of our knowledge as an island growing in the ocean. Well, as an island grows, so its shoreline, the shoreline of ignorance, gets longer and longer. And this is not a bad thing. It's not a despairing thing, because I can tell you a little anecdote which illustrates how exciting it is to be confronted with new problems, new puzzles, with greater domains of ignorance. A very good friend of mine was one of the lead scientists on the compact muon solenoid experiment at CERN in Geneva, looking for the Higgs boson, and then, of course, they found it and announced the discovery of it in 2012. And I said to him afterwards, I said, gosh, it must have been so exciting on the day that you all felt, both the big experiments, compact muon solenoid and the Atlas experiment, that you were able to publish the result of years of work. And here was, this particular Gauge boson found in the field. This mystery about where the particles of the Standard Model got their masses from. Here it had been hypothesized long ago, and now there was empirical support for the theory. It must have been wonderful. And he said, yes, it was. But if we hadn't found it, that would have meant that there was a whole lot more physics to do. Now, it's that attitude, the delight, the relish in there being more to inquire into, more things to discover, more things to find out, which drives the inquiring mind, the mind that wants to try to extend knowledge, even though as the frontiers of knowledge go forward, so we learn there's more and more and more that we need to know. Because every question answered prompts 2 or 3 more questions that need to be answered. And that is the nature of the growth of knowledge. That's how the frontiers of knowledge expand. Sean, that's pretty well it. It's a summary of the book.
Okay, excellent. Well, you've raised a lot of questions. I'll give you a few of mine, and we'll see. Because I was trying to think of what might occur to other people who are watching this because of the current state of things. So one thing I thought about was, are we living in a simulation? Have you ever pondered that? I mean, that's a popular theory these days.
Yes, it is indeed. There are quite well thought through suggestions to the effect that we live in a hologram. For example, this is Leonard Susskind's view. It is certainly the case. Everything that we know about the neuropsychology of perception is that the ordinary everyday world of ordinary everyday physical objects is a virtual reality. To say that it is a virtual reality is not, however, to deny its reality, because, all the layers of reality, from the encounters that we have with automobiles and trees, all the way down to the protons that we smash together at CERN, they're like the sort of onion rings of reality. They're all part of reality. If you were a giant the size of the solar system, you wouldn't be able to distinguish the individual people on the planet. Instead, you might see the solar system as a single thing, as we think of an atom as a single thing, despite having a complex nucleus and a set of electron shells and so forth. So it depends on where you are in the scale as to just how detailed things are. But they're all part of reality, even though at every level they are also, from the point of view of other levels, a kind of virtual reality. So it does surprise people when they think, well, reality may be, sort of unreal. We kind of live in a dream. But then never forget, of course, the fact is that we agree. You and I were able to agree on a time to meet up and do this together. And we're able to use something which is publicly available to more than other people. So we're not solipsists. We're not alone in a made-up reality. There is a reality there, but it is, from the point of view of ordinary experience, a virtual reality.
Right. In the current climate, and we experience this with the pandemic in particular, there seems to be a lot of anti-science. Why do you suppose that is? Anti-intellectualism in general.
Yes. Back in 1959, there was a British writer and scientist called C.P. Snow, who wrote a famous essay called The Two Cultures. And he bemoaned the fact that science and non-science were drifting apart further and further. The bigger gulf of misunderstanding or sort of failure of mutual understanding between them, especially from the point of view of non-science, from their perspective of people who are not scientists, as regards science. And this has very serious practical consequences. Steven Weinberg, famous American physicist, won the Nobel Prize, you may remember, at the time that President Reagan was talking about the Star Wars initiative, putting anti-missile defenses up in space. Steven Weinberg said, It doesn't bother me that the president doesn't know any physics, but it does bother me that he doesn't know any philosophy or history, meaning that if he did, he would just not think of making the Cold War even more serious than it already was. And this shows you that the two sides of the spectrum, the two intellectual halves, so to speak, really do need to be in connection with one another. In fact, one of the points behind this book is that I want to show people how important it is to be literate. You don't have to be an expert or a particle physicist or quantum theorist or anything to have an intelligent layperson's understanding of the sort of general outline of what's happening in science, of what's happening in history, what's happening in the neurosciences of the mind and brain. But you should have an intelligent literacy. You should have some understanding of it so you can be part of the conversation about it. You can use your vote on public policy matters that govern developments in these things. I mean, for example, AI. AI is absolutely amazing extension of human competence in the sense that we now run so much of our societies and our world on AI systems. But we're also thinking of running some of our weapons systems on AI, autonomous weapons systems, the choices and decisions and tactical activities of which are the result of AI calculations. Do we want to do that? And do we need to understand about AI and about how it could operate in weapons systems and change the nature of war in order to decide whether we want to go down that route or not? So we need to be literate about it. And one thing, therefore, I'm arguing in this book is that we need literacy across all these fields. And you're dead right, Sean, there has been a widening gap here. And the great problem with the gap is that the more difficult it is to understand the sciences and what's happening there, the less literate people are about it, the more they grab onto simple theories and pictures and explanations. And the best way to dramatize this is to say, and this I don't intend to offend anybody by saying this, but it is literally true, that you can explain the major doctrines and tenets of any religion in less than half an hour. That takes a bit longer than half an hour to understand physics. And this is the great problem, that people will go for the quick answer, the quick story, the quick explanation, rather than trying to make themselves literate about what we really know and don't know about our world.
Yeah. And there's the popularity of conspiracy theories and people believing things which are demonstrably untrue and sort of losing touch with reality in the sense that we have different realities seemingly running at the same time, but not a multiverse, just people believing things that aren't true. It's kind of frightening to me.
Yes, it is. It is, and it's a function of the lack of application of sort of critical evaluation of the things that people say and the kind of evidence and the reasons that people can advance for things. Again, the quick and easy, the social media, the soundbite, the tweet, the short paragraph on Facebook, it's altogether too easy to chuck an idea out there which has very, very superficial plausibility. And too few people involve themselves in the process of really examining it, of being critical about it. You will, of course, remember Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And his point there is that the great majority of people are fast thinkers in the sense that they're too quick to accept something. They don't examine it. They don't say, hang on, can that be right? WTF, that kind of thing. Whereas the slow thinker is the person who says, okay, so let me assess this a little bit. So what really supports this? What's being claimed on its behalf? Does it stand up? And it's that kind of thing. It's critical thinking. People talk about critical thinking now. It's such a cliche, and we use that phrase all the time. But my word, it is perhaps one of the most important things that education at every level can try to help people acquire an ability to evaluate and to think critically. Because on the internet, at the press of a button, the speed of light, you can get access to huge amounts of data, but also even vaster amounts of nonsense. Those conspiracy theories that you talked about there. So that's an important capacity we should develop.
Right, and the challenge is overcoming what you just mentioned toward the end there, this sort of availability of bad information on social media and the internet. How do we overcome that challenge? And just at this critical time, I think we're losing a lot of liberal arts colleges and even just respect for, as you said, literacy in philosophy and history and science, uh, in favor of sort of very specific knowledge or expertise.
Yes, you put your finger on something really important here, that we've given up education in favor of training, of preparing people to have a skill or a skill set which is apt for them to be good foot soldiers in the economic war. You know, it used to be the case that we educated people, so we gave people a general capacity, a competence, to be able to think, to know how to get information and to see which bits of information are worthwhile and which aren't, a general kind of overview of things, of the past, of the world, and then they specialized. This was the idea behind the liberal arts program, and then you go on to graduate school and you can become a lawyer or a doctor or whatever it might be. We're flipping this now, and we're leaving the more general education up to people spare time after they've been trained for a particular thing. And this is to get it all wrong, because this is to put people in silos. And if you're inside one silo, you may have no understanding of what's happening elsewhere, and therefore you have no context for things. This is the great problem with the conspiracy theories on social media, is that people can't really put them into context and think, you know, how can this possibly make sense in a wider understanding of how the world works and what people's intentions and desires and motivations are, you know, the structures in society. It's that more general literacy, again, I use that word, being sort of literate, aware on a more general scale, into the context of which you can put particular claims, particular theories, and make better sense of them in that way. So I'm with you there. You know, two things have come together: a narrowing of education into training on the one hand, and then the glib, facile, incredibly quick social media enablement of spreading ideas, especially bad ideas, too easily, and slipping past people. Such a tsunami of stuff, really, that people don't stop and think.
Yes. And while I'm waiting for my copy of The Frontiers of Knowledge to get here, I was looking at this book, The Good State. So if you don't mind, I'll shift gears just slightly, but it's still all part of the same overview. So two questions arise. Given all of what we said about lack of critical thinking and literacy, can democracy survive? I know that's what basically that book's about. And have we learned from history?
Well, that book, The Good State, and the one that I did before, which is called Democracy and Its Crisis, address this very, very question. Democracy is under challenge. And one of the big challenges it faces is, in fact, from social media, because the use of micro-targeting of political messaging on social media have had an impact in both your democracy and in mine. In the United Kingdom with the Brexit phenomenon, and in the United States with the election of Donald Trump, there was a major influence from social media targeting groups of people who, if they can be persuaded to take a certain view, can make a big difference to the outcome of an election or of a referendum. Because it's familiarly the case that in two-party setups like yours in the United States and ours in the UK, you have people who are committed to one side or the other. You've got Republicans, you've got Democrats. They're probably going to vote that way, whatever happens. So the campaigns are not going to have that much influence on them. But between them, there's a group of people who haven't made up their minds or who could be persuaded. And you don't have to get all of them. You only have to get part of them to move one way rather than the other, and you tip the balance. And if you can micro-target those people with messaging that only they see, so other people don't see, if you're lying to them or giving them misinformation, other people can't call you out because they don't see those messages. And this is what happened in these cases. We now know after the fact, because it's now in the public domain, that big data analytics we use to profile people, send them very, very specifically targeted messages, and to get just enough people to move to get the Electoral College in the US back in 2016, and to get the Brexit referendum in the UK in 2016. So this is a serious matter. You know, the nature of the game has changed. So how do we defend democracy? Well, one very interesting thing about the US, it's a more complicated situation here because we don't have a codified constitution, and we've got a real mess of traditions and conventions and stuff. I mean, at the moment we have a government. I'm going to be partisan here, okay? Give up any kind of neutrality. We have an absolute hell of a useless government here, which was elected on a minority vote, and yet it has a huge majority in the House of Commons, which is the equivalent of the House of Representatives. So it can do what it likes because Parliament in the UK is sovereign. There are no constitutional checks on its power. And a minority of people can give a majority of seats in that legislature, which is then unbridled in what it can do. And that's what's happening here at the moment. And it's a really, really serious problem. Now, in the US, critics in the US itself will point to the fact that you have first past the post voting for the House of Representatives. That's a very undemocratic voting procedure. It causes two-party politics. So you've got Republicans and Democrats. The division between Republicans and Democrats has become very bitter. And it's so divided and polarized, really awful to see, but it's the same here in the UK. And you have a Senate, which is not democratic because it's a state's house. Every state sends two senators. The small Midwestern states send two senators. They tend to be more conservative than the big California, New York, and so on. So you get an inbuilt conservative majority in the Senate, which blocks things that even a Democratic House of Representatives might want to do. So all that doesn't look great. And then, of course, the Electoral College has twice this century put presidents into the White House who didn't win the popular vote. Mm-hmm. So in the case of George W. and Trump, that happened. So these are problems. And yet the United States has something which the United Kingdom doesn't have. And that is the most amazing legal system. It is the system of laws and courts in the US, which is really the salvation of the US. And it's very, very impressive how often during the Trump administration, when Trump was doing things like rescinding the Paris Accords on climate change, that some of the states like California, for example, were disagreeing, or when he was putting limits on immigrants, that courts were overturning that. It's a very, very impressive legal structure in the United States. With one exception, which is that the Supreme Court is a politically appointed court. And that is the problem because separation of powers is terribly important there too. Yes. But the United States is, if you look at what happened last November, every single state worked incredibly hard to count every single vote and to do it well and to do it honestly and judiciously. Even Republican states were counting the Democratic majority that emerged in that state on that occasion. It was very, very impressive how all the principles of democracy were so robustly defended in the United States. I think, if I had a magic wand, I would want to wave it over President Biden and say, look, use your honeymoon, use your first term to introduce some reforms about voting and about the Senate and about the Electoral College and things, because these are obvious problems. But for an outsider like me to be saying that when we've got bigger problems back in my own country, and our own country is just descending into the pits because of them, and the United States is, getting back up and way up on its feet and leading the world again now with President Biden, as you see in Europe at the moment. So there is still hope for democracy, even with the problems that our democracies face. There's still hope for it. And I think that relatively small reforms, particularly electoral reforms and the constitutional arrangements on things like Senate and Supreme Court appointments and the Electoral College, relatively small in themselves, although they might be difficult to achieve with the need for all the states and Congress and so on to agree, but relatively small could make the democracy work very, very well. Same thing here in the UK. There are reforms that we could do that would make our democracy much better functioning. And the key one is electoral reform.
And we have a question from the audience, so I'm going to put it on the screen for you to read.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Elizabeth, for that question. I think there is a good way to go with education. The most important period in anybody's education is the beginning, is early education. Now, all sorts of experiments have been tried with early education, getting kids to find out for themselves, which is a wonderful way to learn for certain sorts of subject matters. Personally, I'm a big believer in the nuts and bolts, things like being able to multiply and spell. These are things we should learn by rote, so they're completely automatic. You've got all the basics available to you, so that you can go on and then do stuff, finding out for yourself, dealing with materials which tell you something about nature, creating experiments, working with your hands and your mind together. These are wonderful ways of learning. But the nuts and bolts, basic understanding, frameworks of understanding of the history of the world and of the larger picture, providing a context into which you can fix things. So in the first 6 to 10 years of education, all that can be put into place. And that is where the investment and the time, the effort, the energy, small classes, very, very well paid, highly paid teachers who are very dedicated, get those first 6 to 10 years right, and you're going to get a lot else right. Then the second thing to say is that what Sean and I were discussing earlier was the fact that to educate people, that is to give them this broader basis, this broader understanding of the world and its past and of how it works, and of our understanding of sort of literacy about what we know so far about things in science, in history, in psychology. These areas of understanding, again, will provide us with a really good basis on which to specialize and to dig deeper into something. Everybody should have an expertise, but the expertise should not be naked. It shouldn't be bereft of connections with other things, because in the end, what we want is to achieve that thing which is further and greater than knowledge even, and that is understanding. Understanding what we know, understanding how to apply it, understanding which bits of it are worthwhile and not, and being able to connect our knowledge with our values and with how we're going to live as individuals and as a society, making best use of our knowledge. Not negatively, not to create weapons of war, etc., but in positive ways. And I end on this point. What the philosopher Theodor Adorno said, we human beings have grown cleverer over time, but not wiser, as illustrated by the fact that we have developed the spear into the guided missile. That shows cleverness. But the fact that we're still making things to kill other people shows that we haven't got any wiser. And so education should be aimed at wisdom, really, in the end, the achievement of understanding.
That is a good point to end on. And thank you, Professor, for joining us today. It has been an honor. And I'm looking forward to reading this book as soon as my copy arrives. I may have a few more questions at that point.
Good.
Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on, Joe.
Okay. Folks, Thursday evening, Art Evans, Beatles, 6:30 p.m. Be there. We'll see you next week for Robin Yoakum. Goodbye, everyone. Thanks, Doc.
Bye.